On a summer morning in 1915, the Chicago River moved through its narrow industrial channel, beneath steel bridges and along crowded wharves, where passenger steamers briefly paused between the routines of city transport and lake travel. Along one dock, the SS Eastland sat secured in place as boarding began, its presence appearing ordinary within the steady rhythm of workers gathering for an excursion that, at first glance, carried no sense of urgency or disruption. Yet in this confined stretch of water, where movement was limited and weight was quietly accumulating, the conditions around the vessel were already forming a situation that would not remain ordinary for long. As you follow this account, the focus shifts beneath the surface of what was visible that day, into the documented changes made to the ship, the environmental limits of the Chicago River, and the subtle engineering realities that shaped how stability could be lost without warning, in a space that allowed little room for correction. River of Departure, Chicago's morning gathering on the Chicago River. Along the narrow stretch of the Chicago River on a summer morning in 1915, the air carried a heavy mix of coal smoke, industrial steam, and the constant movement of a city built on steel and water, where bridges rose and lowered with mechanical patience as freight and passenger vessels threaded between them in tight, deliberate paths. Along the riverfront near the Clark Street Bridge, crowds gathered with an unusual density, not as spectators, but as participants in a large corporate excursion that had become part of the era's industrial culture. The vessel waiting at the dock, the SS Eastland, sat low in the water even before departure, its presence blending into the river traffic in a way that did not immediately suggest the events that were about to unfold. The city around the Chicago River at that time was a place of relentless motion, where steel factories, warehouses, and office buildings pressed tightly against the water's edge, and the river itself functioned as both highway and artery for commerce. Workers from large industrial employers, including Western Electric, were assembling in organized groups for an employee excursion across Lake Michigan, a common practice intended to provide relief from long work weeks spent in the factory system. The SS Eastland had been chartered for this purpose, and its decks gradually filled with passengers whose expectations were shaped more by routine than by concern. There was an observable rhythm to boarding on the river that morning, shaped by dock workers, crew instructions, and the slow movement of hundreds of people stepping across narrow gangways. Yet beneath that rhythm, there was a subtle imbalance that few seemed to register, as the vessel's structure responded to shifting weight in ways that were not visible to the casual observer. The SS Eastland had already developed a reputation in maritime circles for handling that could feel unstable under certain conditions, a characteristic that had been discussed but never fully resolved in operational practice. The origins of that instability were tied to earlier modifications made to the ship after its construction, particularly changes influenced by safety requirements that followed maritime disasters in preceding years. Additional lifeboats and equipment had been installed to meet regulatory expectations, yet these additions altered the vessel's centre of gravity in ways that were not fully counterbalanced by structural redesign. On the Chicago River, where currents were minimal but spatial constraints were severe, such changes created conditions where even minor shifts in passenger movement could have amplified effects. As boarding continued, the human element became increasingly dense, with families, co-workers, and supervisors moving across the deck in clusters, filling open spaces faster than they could redistribute weight evenly across the vessel. The SS Eastland responded to these changes with subtle tilting that was perceptible to some crew members, but not enough to interrupt the process unfolding under schedule pressure. The expectation was that once departure began, natural balancing would occur as passengers settled into assigned areas and the vessel entered open water. The Chicago River itself contributed an additional layer of constraint, its narrowness limiting manoeuvring, and its banks holding the ship in a confined corridor where adjustments could not easily be made once a situation developed. Unlike open lake conditions, where a vessel could correct its orientation gradually, the river offered no such margin, and the proximity of docks, bridges, and adjacent vessels created a setting where every movement had immediate consequences. Within this environment, the SS Eastland remained stationary, absorbing the weight of a growing human load that was becoming increasingly difficult to distribute. Observers on the riverbank noted the scale of the boarding, but not necessarily its implications, as large corporate excursions were common and often visually striking in industrial Chicago. The presence of uniformed workers, coordinated schedules, and organized departure procedures gave the scene an appearance of control. masking the underlying mechanical sensitivity of the vessel itself. On board the SS Eastland, however, the gradual compression of space and shifting balance were already creating conditions that required more attention than the routine operation allowed. Even as the final groups of passengers were guided aboard, there was no immediate signal that departure would be disrupted, only a growing sense of weight that manifested in the way the deck responded underfoot. The river remained calm, reflecting the surrounding industrial architecture in distorted fragments, while the ship absorbed each additional step of human presence. In this stillness, the SS Eastland stood as a vessel fully engaged in the ordinary act of boarding, while quietly approaching a threshold that remained unseen to most of those on board. And as the final preparations for departure continued along the Chicago River, the conditions aboard the SS Eastland were already shifting in ways that would soon redefine the entire morning without warning. As the balance between river, vessel, and passenger load moved toward an uncertain edge that had not yet been recognized. Crowded decks and quiet warnings beneath the surface. Within the tightening geometry of human movement aboard the vessel, what began as orderly boarding along the Chicago River continued to unfold without interruption, even as the available space on deck became progressively redefined by the sheer density of bodies entering at once. The riverbank activity outside remained consistent with other large industrial excursions of the era, where coordinated employee travel was treated as both logistical routine and social event. Yet aboard the SS Eastland, the visible order of boarding gradually concealed a more complex internal shift in how weight and space were being distributed. What could be seen from the dock appeared controlled and methodical, but the internal reality of the vessel was becoming increasingly defined by accumulation rather than flow, as each new group of passengers altered the balance of the deck in ways that were not immediately distinguishable to those involved. Beneath the surface of what appeared to be routine passenger organisation, the gradual accumulation of weight across the SS Eastland's upper structure began to express itself through subtle shifts in how space was occupied and redistributed during boarding. The ship, designed in an earlier maritime context and later modified to meet evolving safety requirements that followed major transatlantic disasters, carried additional structural weight in the form of lifeboats and equipment that had altered its original balance characteristics. These modifications, while intended to increase safety compliance, had introduced a new relationship between load distribution and stability that depended heavily on how passengers moved and settled. As large groups continued to enter the vessel in coordinated waves, the deck became less of an open platform and more of a continuously adjusting surface, where every step contributed to a slow recalibration of equilibrium that remained largely invisible to perception. Beneath this surface impression, the concentration of passengers continues to increase in uneven patterns as movement is guided more by boarding flow than by evenly distributed placement. Areas of the upper decks become progressively denser, while lower sections remain comparatively less occupied, creating a vertical imbalance that becomes increasingly significant in terms of stability dynamics. The vessel does not yet display dramatic physical change, but its posture against the water begins to reflect subtle shifts that occur as internal distribution evolves. In this stage, the ship remains technically stable in appearance, even as the conditions required for maintaining that stability are gradually narrowing. From a structural standpoint already documented in maritime records, the SS Eastland's handling characteristics had previously drawn attention within operational contexts where stability was influenced by uneven loading conditions and modifications made after its initial construction. Reports and historical accounts from its service history indicate that the vessel had experienced notable listing tendencies even before its 1915 configuration, including incidents where it developed a pronounced heel under certain conditions while still docked or lightly loaded. These characteristics were not necessarily uncommon in mechanically complex passenger vessels of the time, but in the confined operational environment of the Chicago River, where external corrective maneuvering was limited, such tendencies carried a different kind of weight. The behaviour of the vessel under incremental loading was not dramatic in isolation, yet it followed a pattern that became increasingly significant as passenger density increased without corresponding redistribution. Encased within the narrow corridor of the Chicago River, the vessel existed in a navigational environment where lateral adjustment and corrective maneuvering were inherently limited by the river's constrained width and industrial shoreline infrastructure. Unlike open water conditions, where a ship could gradually correct imbalance through movement and directional change, the river imposed a fixed spatial discipline that restricted both motion and response. bridges overhead, dock structures along the banks, and the constant presence of other working vessels created an operational setting where repositioning was not simply difficult but structurally constrained. Within this framework, the SS Eastland remained effectively stationary during boarding, absorbing increasing load while lacking the environmental freedom that would normally allow a vessel to naturally re-establish equilibrium through forward motion. Across the crowded expanse of observation and participation, there remained a consistent disconnect between what those aboard perceived as a normal departure sequence and the underlying mechanical responses that were gradually taking shape beneath their collective awareness. The human experience of boarding was governed by social organisation, work schedules, and the expectation of a routine excursion, while the physical system supporting that experience was responding to each addition of weight in incremental and cumulative ways. The presence of large groups on the upper decks, combined with the natural movement of passengers adjusting positions, created a dynamic environment in which stability was continuously being recalculated without visible indication. What appeared externally as a completed boarding process was, in structural terms, still in an active state of adjustment, shaped by forces that were not yet interpreted as significant by those closest to them. Long before any outward disruption would define the morning, the conditions shaping the vessel's balance were already being silently governed by structural decisions that extended far beyond the immediacy of the Chicago River itself. A design. Questioned. The engineering history of instability. Stepping beyond the immediate conditions of boarding and crowd distribution, the underlying behaviour of the vessel begins to reveal itself as something shaped not only by present activity, but by the cumulative effects of its earlier engineering decisions. What is occurring on the Chicago River at this moment cannot be fully understood through observation alone, because the visible arrangement of passengers and movement on deck is only one layer of a system that has been altered repeatedly since the vessel first entered service. In this sense, the ship is not responding solely to the people aboard it, but also to the structural history embedded within its construction, modifications and operational adaptations over time, where each change has left behind a subtle but lasting influence on how weight is carried and distributed. Constructed during a period when Great Lakes passenger travel was expanding rapidly, the SS Eastland was originally intended to operate as a conventional excursion steamer, before subsequent alterations began to redefine its structural balance. Built for service on Lake Michigan, it entered a commercial environment where passenger transport between Chicago and nearby destinations was a common and competitive enterprise, requiring vessels that could accommodate large numbers of people efficiently and safely. However, as operational requirements evolved, the ship's configuration did not remain static, and changes introduced during its service life gradually shifted the relationship between hull design, weight capacity, and stability response. What had initially been a design suited for a specific balance of load and buoyancy began to behave differently once its original parameters were modified in practice. In the aftermath of early 20th century maritime safety reforms, prompted by the Titanic disaster of 1912, additional lifeboats and associated equipment were mandated across passenger vessels, introducing significant changes in overall ship weight distribution. These regulations were intended to improve survival capacity in emergency situations, but they also introduced new engineering challenges, particularly for ships whose original designs had not accounted for such additional topside weight. In the case of vessels operating on inland waters and the Great Lakes, the effect of these changes was not merely theoretical, as the added mass altered how ships responded to loading conditions and how their centres of gravity shifted during passenger movement. The SS Eastland, like many vessels of its era, was subjected to these regulatory adjustments, and the resulting structural implications became part of its operational reality. Within naval architecture principles governing buoyancy and equilibrium, stability is determined by the relationship between a vessel's centre of gravity and the distribution of mass across its hull, a relationship that becomes increasingly sensitive when structural modifications are introduced without comprehensive redesign. When weight is added higher above the hull's centre line, even if introduced for safety purposes, the overall balance of the vessel can become more reactive to shifts in passenger positioning or uneven loading. In confined environments such as river docking areas, where external corrective movement is limited, these sensitivities are not easily mitigated through navigation alone. Instead, stability becomes a condition influenced not only by design, but by how the vessel is used in real-time operational settings. Examining the operational record of the SS Eastland prior to 1915, reveals multiple documented moments where the vessel demonstrated a tendency to list noticeably while still under controlled conditions, observations that were noted within maritime service reports yet never fully translated into a permanent structural correction. These recorded behaviours did not necessarily prevent continued use of the vessel, but they formed part of a pattern that indicated sensitivity to loading conditions that could shift under certain circumstances. In maritime practice, such tendencies often require either design adjustment or operational restriction. Yet in many working vessels of the time, practical demands of service frequently outweighed the opportunity for extensive reconstruction. As a result, the ship continued to operate within a framework where known characteristics were managed rather than fundamentally resolved. From the perspective of both engineering assessment and operational experience, the accumulation of these factors created a condition in which stability was no longer defined solely by design intent, but by the interaction between inherited structural characteristics and evolving usage patterns. Each modification, regulatory requirement, and operational adaptation added another layer to a system that now responded less predictably under concentrated load conditions. In a confined river environment where external maneuverability was limited and loading occurred in compressed timeframes, these layered influences did not remain theoretical. They became active components of how the vessel behaved in the water. As these accumulated design influences converge within a confined waterway, the distinction between engineering condition and environmental setting begins to blur in ways that would soon define the vessel's behaviour beyond its documented history. The Chicago River factor: water, current, and hidden pressure. Extending the analytical perspective beyond the vessel's internal structural behaviour, attention gradually shifts toward the surrounding river environment that continuously interacts with the ship during its stationary position along the Chicago River. What initially appears to be a simple backdrop for boarding activity reveals itself as a controlled and highly constrained waterway, where the physical characteristics of the channel play an active role in shaping how large vessels behave even before departure. In this setting, the SS Eastland is not operating in isolation, but within a narrow industrial corridor where water depth, river width, and shoreline infrastructure collectively define the limits of movement. The river becomes part of the system of stability itself, influencing how weight distribution and balance are expressed while passengers continue to board. Between the tightly controlled riverbanks of early 20th century industrial Chicago, the navigable channel where the SS Eastland was moored offered only minimal spatial allowance for lateral adjustment or corrective movement once boarding had begun. The Chicago River at the time was a heavily engineered waterway, shaped by decades of industrial expansion and urban development that prioritized commercial navigation through a dense cityscape of bridges, docks, and warehouses. Within this confined corridor, a vessel of significant size had little opportunity to shift position or redistribute balance through movement, because any attempt at adjustment was restricted by both physical boundaries and surrounding infrastructure. As a result, the ship remained in a fixed orientation, while internal conditions continued to evolve through the constant addition of passengers. Through the relatively shallow depths characteristic of the Chicago River's engineered waterway system, vessels of significant size experience reduced vertical flexibility, where even minor changes in load distribution can produce amplified sensitivity and balance behaviour. In general naval architecture terms, shallow water conditions limit the available margin for hull immersion and can reduce the natural buffering capacity that deeper waters provide against shifting loads. While the Chicago River was not an open maritime environment, its depth constraints still influenced how vessels responded to weight changes, particularly when large numbers of passengers concentrated on upper decks. In such conditions, the relationship between buoyancy and load becomes more sensitive, meaning that stability is no longer governed solely by design, but also by the limited vertical space available for displacement. Within the engineered flow system of the Chicago River, where water movement had been historically altered through human intervention and industrial regulation, the hydrodynamic conditions surrounding a stationary vessel are shaped as much by infrastructure as by natural current behaviour. Unlike open waterways where currents may flow freely and consistently in one direction, the Chicago River had undergone extensive modification over time, including engineering projects that altered its natural flow patterns to serve urban and industrial needs. These changes created a water environment that was not purely natural nor entirely static, but instead a managed system where flow characteristics could vary depending on location, structures, and operational conditions. Even when a vessel like the SS Eastland remained stationary during boarding, it existed within this modified hydrological context, where subtle water movement and pressure differentials could still interact with the hull. Against the fixed positioning imposed by docking structures and river edge constraints, the SS Eastland remained anchored in place, while continuing to respond passively to external environmental pressures that could not be counteracted through navigational movement. Docking in such a confined river environment meant that the vessel's ability to correct imbalance through forward motion or repositioning was effectively absent, leaving only internal redistribution of weight as the primary means of maintaining equilibrium. At the same time, the physical presence of docks, pilings, and adjacent structures created a rigid spatial boundary that defined not only where the ship could be, but also how it could respond to changing conditions aboard. In this state of constrained positioning, the vessel existed in a condition where stability depended on static balance rather than dynamic adjustment, a situation that becomes increasingly sensitive as additional load is introduced. As environmental constraints and structural conditions converge within the same confined space, the boundary between external pressure and internal balance begins to narrow in a way that sets the stage for the next phase of loading and movement, final boarding, when capacity quietly crossed the limit. Continuing forward from the tightly constrained environmental conditions of the Chicago River, the boarding process aboard the vessel proceeds without interruption, maintaining the outward appearance of procedural normality even as internal conditions continue to evolve beneath the surface of perception. From the riverbank perspective, nothing appears to deviate from the expected rhythm of a large industrial excursion, where groups of employees are guided aboard in organised waves, and the vessel remains stationary against the dock in a controlled loading sequence. Yet within this continuity, there is an unfolding shift that is not visible in discrete moments but rather in accumulation, as each new cluster of passengers becomes part of a system that is gradually altering its own internal balance without any single, identifiable point of transition. Progressively within the boarding sequence, the distribution of human presence across the SS Eastland transitions from organised placement into increasingly concentrated zones of occupancy that begin to redefine how available space is being utilised across the vessel's upper structure. The ship, originally designed for passenger transport on the Great Lakes, was structured to accommodate large groups, but not necessarily in the concentrated and static configurations that develop during extended boarding periods in a confined river environment. As groups gather and settle in specific areas, often near railings or open deck sections, the spatial distribution becomes less uniform, creating localized concentrations of weight that subtly influence how the vessel sits in the water. These shifts are not abrupt or visually dramatic, but they represent incremental changes in load distribution that accumulate over time. Observationally across maritime behavior patterns, even minor shifts in passenger positioning aboard a stationary vessel can introduce measurable variations in weight distribution, particularly when large groups adjust simultaneously within confined deck areas. This principle becomes more significant when applied to vessels that have undergone structural modifications affecting their original balance characteristics, as the relationship between movement and stability becomes more sensitive under such conditions. The SS Eastland, like other passenger vessels of its era, operates within a system where equilibrium is maintained through a continuous balancing of forces between hull, load, and buoyancy. In situations where movement is restricted to small-scale internal adjustments rather than navigational repositioning, the cumulative effect of these micro-movements becomes increasingly relevant to overall stability. As boarding continues without interruption, the deck environment begins to function less as a passive surface and more as an active system of redistribution, where each new arrival modifies not only available space, but also the internal geometry of weight across the vessel. Even the act of pausing within a crowded area contributes to localized clustering, gradually reinforcing uneven patterns that remain imperceptible at the level of individual perception, but significant when viewed as a total system response. In this stage, stability is no longer governed solely by design intent, but by the continuous interaction between structural limits and accumulated presence. Despite the ongoing accumulation of passengers and the gradual intensification of onboard density, the vessel continues to exhibit an outward appearance of equilibrium, where stability is maintained not through absence of change, but through the slow absorption of continuous micro-adjustments. This form of apparent stability is not static but dynamic in nature, relying on constant internal redistribution of weight as passengers board, pause, shift positions, and settle into available space. From an external perspective, the ship appears steady against the dock, held in place by its mooring and the calm conditions of the Chicago River. However, beneath this visible stillness, the internal distribution of mass is continuously recalibrating, responding to each additional person who steps aboard and each subtle movement made in response to crowding. During the final phase of boarding operations documented in historical accounts of the excursion, the concentration of passengers aboard the SS Eastland reached a level where additional movement no longer contributed to simple redistribution, but instead added cumulative strain to an already limited margin of stability. The historical context of the event includes organised employee groups, including large numbers of workers from industrial firms such as Western Electric, whose coordinated excursion contributed to the rapid and concentrated loading of the vessel within a relatively short time frame. At this stage, the boarding process was no longer simply an orderly sequence of entry, but a compression of available space that increasingly reduced the vessel's capacity to accommodate further internal adjustment without affecting its overall equilibrium. The distinction between individual movement and collective weight impact becomes less defined as density increases, creating a condition where each additional shift contributes to a broader systemic load. Within this environment, stability is not lost in a single moment, but becomes increasingly dependent on a narrowing range of acceptable conditions that are continually being tested by the act of boarding itself. The vessel remains moored and visually steady, yet the relationship between its internal load distribution and external environmental constraints is becoming more sensitive as the threshold of capacity is approached. What remains particularly significant is that no single action or moment signals a definitive change. Instead, the system transitions through accumulation, where the effect of many small ordinary movements converges into a condition that is no longer governed by earlier levels of flexibility, with every remaining margin of space effectively absorbed by accumulated presence and constrained movement. The system governing stability begins to shift beyond the range of controlled adjustment into conditions defined purely by cumulative load. The moment of failure, the capsizing of the river passenger ship. Moments after the final phase of boarding reaches a state of apparent completion, the vessel remains positioned along the Chicago River in a condition that outwardly resembles stability, even as internal forces continue to adjust, in ways that are no longer visibly distinguishable from normal operational stillness. The SS Eastland sits tightly against its docked position, restrained by mooring lines and the narrow geometry of the river, while hundreds of passengers remain distributed across its upper decks in a configuration that appears settled from a distance. From the riverbank, the scene still carries the structure of a routine excursion departure, shaped by early 20th century industrial rhythm, where large groups of workers gathered for organised travel across Lake Michigan was a familiar and accepted occurrence within Chicago's working landscape. Yet within the vessel itself, the accumulation of weight and movement has already reached a condition where stability is no longer governed by visible change, but by internal thresholds that are approaching their limit. Without any preceding structural warning that would be perceptible to most observers, the balance of the SS Eastland begins to alter through a gradual but decisive shift in weight distribution that initiates a measurable deviation from its previously held equilibrium. The change does not present itself as an abrupt external shock, but rather as a response within a system already operating near its sensitivity threshold, where even small internal adjustments can influence overall stability. The concentration of passengers on the upper decks, combined with the vessel's already modified structural characteristics, creates a condition in which the centre of gravity becomes increasingly responsive to movement. As individuals shift position, adjust footing, or respond to crowd density, the cumulative effect of these micro-movements begins to express itself in the vessel's posture against the water. As the angle of inclination increases beyond the vessel's initial compensatory range, the redistribution of mass across its upper structure accelerates the imbalance, creating a feedback effect in which movement contributes directly to further destabilization. In maritime stability terms, once a vessel passes a critical threshold of heel, the natural corrective forces that normally restore equilibrium are no longer sufficient to counteract the shifting centre of gravity. Instead, the The act of leaning itself alters how weight is distributed across the hull, intensifying the very condition that initiated the movement. On the Chicago River, where external motion is constrained by narrow channels and docking structures, there is no opportunity for forward momentum or navigational correction to re-establish balance. The system transitions from controlled stability into a rapidly evolving physical response that is governed entirely by internal redistribution. Constrained entirely by the narrow boundaries of the Chicago River and the fixed positioning of the dock, the vessel is unable to execute any navigational correction that might otherwise mitigate the progression of its increasing list. Unlike open water conditions where a ship can maneuver to redistribute forces through directional movement, the SS Eastland remains effectively locked in place, its hull interacting continuously with a fixed shoreline environment. The river itself offers no spatial allowance for lateral correction, and the presence of dock infrastructure further restricts any potential displacement. In this confined setting, the vessel's stability is no longer a dynamic balance between movement and water, but a static condition in which internal forces must resolve themselves without external adjustment. As the imbalance deepens, the absence of corrective capacity becomes a defining factor in how rapidly the situation progresses. Historical records of the incident confirm that the SS Eastland completed its transition from upright position to full inversion, while still moored in the river, marking a continuous structural failure sequence rather than a sudden isolated impact event. The movement of capsizing unfolds as a single connected progression, beginning with an increasing list that surpasses recovery capacity and continuing through a sustained rotational shift that brings the vessel beyond its point of equilibrium. As the hull rotates, waterline orientation changes rapidly, and the structural geometry of the ship responds to forces that now exceed its ability to maintain vertical alignment. The overturning occurs within the confined space of the Chicago River, where there is no room for dispersion of motion, causing the sequence of failure to remain concentrated and uninterrupted until the vessel is fully inverted against the water's surface. What remains above the river surface is no longer defined by the vessel's intended form, as the surrounding water and overturned structure merge into a single disrupted environment, where orientation itself loses meaning. Inside the waterline, panic, rescue, and the fight for survival. Immediately following the complete inversion of the vessel within the confined space of the Chicago River, the surrounding environment shifts into a disordered equilibrium where surface, structure, and waterline no longer maintain their previous spatial distinctions. The SS Eastland, now fully overturned while still within the tight constraints of the river and adjacent dock infrastructure, exists in a state where orientation has ceased to function as a reliable reference point, and the distinction between interior and exterior becomes blurred by water intrusion and structural displacement. What had moments earlier been a controlled boarding process has now transformed into a static but unstable configuration, where the vessel's hull rests in a position that was never intended in its design, and the river itself becomes an enclosing medium rather than a navigable channel. From the riverbank, the scene is no longer one of departure but of abrupt redefinition, where the expected motion of travel is replaced by a fixed and inverted structure occupying the same constrained space. Within the overturned interior of the SS Eastland, conditions become defined by fragmented spatial awareness, where compartments, passageways, and structural boundaries are no longer aligned with their original orientation or intended function. The interior architecture, designed for horizontal movement and orderly passenger distribution, is now rotated and partially submerged, creating a complex environment where gravity and water pressure act simultaneously in unfamiliar directions. Air pockets form in irregular sections of the hull, while other areas are rapidly inundated, producing uneven survivability conditions that vary from one enclosed space to another. In this environment, movement is not guided by design, but by physical possibility, where individuals must navigate surfaces that were not intended to be traversed in their current orientation, and where visibility is limited by both structural obstruction and the presence of water within enclosed spaces. Through areas where structural deformation and partial openings allow intermittent movement, survival becomes dependent on localized access points, rather than any uniform or predictable internal pathway. As the vessel settles into its inverted position, certain structural weaknesses and openings become temporary routes through which movement toward air or exit points becomes possible, though none of these paths offer consistent accessibility across the entire interior. The confined nature of the Chicago River further intensifies these conditions, as the overturned hull remains pressed within a narrow spatial corridor that restricts external intervention and limits the availability of large-scale structural access. Within this constrained environment, the distinction between viable escape routes and blocked passages is not immediately apparent, and movement becomes a matter of immediate physical opportunity rather than planned direction. Along the edges of the Chicago River, the sudden transformation of the vessel triggers an immediate but uncoordinated response from those nearby, as industrial workers, dockside observers, and riverfront activity converge toward the scene. The proximity of factories, docks, and commercial infrastructure in early 20th century Chicago means that the riverfront is not an isolated space, but one integrated into the daily rhythm of industrial labour and transportation. As the capsizing occurs, individuals from surrounding areas begin to react almost simultaneously, moving toward the river's edge as awareness of the event spreads through visual confirmation and rapid communication among those present. The absence of pre-established emergency coordination systems at the time contributes to a response that is immediate but structurally unorganized, shaped more by proximity and instinct than by formal procedure. In the rapidly evolving aftermath, emergent rescue actions begin to take shape within the confined river environment, where limited access, overturned structure, and dense human presence collectively shape the early phases of external response efforts. Boats, river workers, and nearby labourers begin to participate in efforts to reach individuals visible or accessible within and around the overturned hull, while the physical constraints of the river limit the scale and speed of intervention. The SS Eastland's position against the dock and within the narrow channel further complicates these efforts, as space for manoeuvring is restricted and access points are unevenly distributed along the hull's exposed surfaces. At the same time, the large number of people involved in the excursion creates an immediate need for rapid and continuous assistance, placing additional pressure on those attempting to coordinate rescue activity within a physically constrained environment. Beyond the immediate struggle within the overturned vessel and the surrounding river, the focus gradually shifts toward tracing the conditions that transformed a routine departure into an event now requiring systematic examination. Searching for responsibility, investigations into a preventable disaster. Documentation emerging from the hours after rescue efforts along the Chicago River begins to redirect focus away from physical recovery and towards structured attempts to reconstruct how the sequence of events unfolded. What had only recently been a scene defined by immediate movement, noise, and emergency response gradually transitions into a different kind of environment, one shaped by records, reports, and the careful assembly of testimony. The SS Eastland disaster of 1915, which occurred while the vessel was still moored in the Chicago River, does not remain confined to the physical space of the riverfront, but begins to extend into administrative offices, engineering discussions, and public hearings where the event is reinterpreted through documentation rather than direct experience. In this shift, the tragedy is no longer observed as an unfolding moment, but as a fixed historical incident that must be analysed through fragmented accounts and technical evidence. Public response in Chicago during the days following the SS Eastland disaster in 1915 develops into sustained scrutiny, where attention moves from the visible aftermath at the riverfront into deeper questions about the conditions that allowed such an event to occur. The scale of loss, involving hundreds of lives during a single excursion departure on the Chicago River, transforms what had been an industrial routine into a focal point of civic concern. Newspapers, public discussions, and municipal attention begin to concentrate on the circumstances of the capsizing, particularly because it occurred not in open water, but within a confined urban waterway where the vessel had been stationary. This setting intensifies public questioning, as the disaster appears not as the result of a distant maritime voyage, but as something that developed within the immediate infrastructure of the city itself. Technical examination of the vessel in official reviews brings earlier structural modifications into focus, particularly the post-1912 addition of lifeboats and equipment that altered the distribution of weight across the ship's upper sections. These modifications, introduced in response to maritime safety reforms following the RMS Titanic disaster, were intended to increase survival capacity in emergency conditions, yet they also introduced new considerations regarding vessel stability. In the case of the SS Eastland, such changes became central to engineering analysis, as investigators and maritime experts examined how additional topside weight could influence the centre of gravity and overall balance characteristics of the ship. Rather than being viewed in isolation, these modifications were assessed as part of a broader structural system in which even safety-driven changes could produce unintended effects when combined with existing design limitations and operational loading conditions. Maritime oversight during the early 20th century on the Great Lakes operated within a regulatory environment where evolving safety standards and practical shipbuilding realities did not always align in implementation or enforcement. Passenger vessels operating in inland and nearshore waters were subject to inspection and compliance requirements, yet the rapid expansion of industrial transportation and excursion travel created conditions where operational demands often intersected with evolving regulatory expectations. In this context, safety frameworks were still developing, and the translation of new rules into consistent structural redesigns varied across different vessels and operators. The SS Eastland becomes part of this broader regulatory landscape, where compliance, design adaptation, and operational practice intersect in ways that were not always fully harmonised within a single engineering approach. Interpretations recorded across subsequent inquiries present responsibility as a convergence of multiple contributing elements, where design decisions, loading practices, and environmental constraints are assessed without a single dominant conclusion. In examining the disaster, different analytical perspectives emerge, each focusing on a specific aspect of the vessel's condition or operating environment, including structural configuration, passenger distribution, and the limitations imposed by the Chicago River's confined docking space. Rather than converging into one unified explanation, these perspectives remain distributed across technical, operational, and environmental considerations, reflecting the complexity of attributing causation in systems where multiple factors interact simultaneously. This layered interpretation becomes a defining feature of the investigative record, where clarity is shaped not by singular explanation, but by the accumulation of interrelated findings. Over the longer historical timeline, the disaster becomes embedded within an expanding framework of safety evolution and institutional learning that continues to reshape how its causes are understood. Silent aftermath, memory, reforms, and the river that remembered. Closure of formal investigative activity marks a shift in how the SS Eastland disaster is positioned within historical records, moving it from active inquiry into preserved documentation. What had once been a subject of immediate technical analysis, public urgency, and institutional response gradually becomes part of a structured archival narrative, where the event is no longer examined in real time but reconstructed through reports, testimonies, and recorded findings. In this transition, the disaster begins to settle into a different kind of existence, one defined less by unfolding consequence and more by how it is preserved within official and historical frameworks. The Chicago River, once the immediate setting of the catastrophe, remains physically unchanged in its industrial function, while the memory of what occurred along its edge begins to separate from the continuous activity that surrounds it. Maritime safety frameworks across the Great Lakes gradually incorporate lessons derived from earlier passenger vessel incidents, contributing to incremental adjustments in regulatory standards during the decades following 1915. Rather than emerging from a single moment of reform, these changes develop through a series of adaptations influenced by multiple incidents, operational reviews, and evolving technological capabilities within the shipping industry. Regulatory systems during this period are shaped by both practical experience and institutional learning, where inspection procedures, vessel certification processes, and operational guidelines are refined over time to reflect observed risks and historical outcomes. The SS Eastland becomes part of this wider regulatory narrative, serving as one reference point among many in a developing system that seeks to balance industrial efficiency with passenger safety. In this broader context, maritime regulation evolves not as a fixed structure, but as a continually adjusting framework responding to the accumulated weight of experience across different vessels and environments. Within this gradual fading of public attention, ship design and operational protocols in 20th century passenger transport continue evolving in response to accumulated historical incidents, influencing broader approaches to stability awareness and safety planning. As maritime engineering advances, greater emphasis is placed on understanding how modifications, loading distribution, and structural configuration interact under real operational conditions, particularly in vessels designed to carry large numbers of passengers. lessons derived from earlier events become embedded in inspection routines, design standards, and safety evaluations, forming part of an evolving technical framework that prioritizes preventive assessment over reactive correction. In educational and professional settings, maritime stability is increasingly treated not only as a theoretical principle, but as a practical consideration shaped by historical experience, where case studies inform how engineers and operators approach vessel safety in a systemic way. Although no single incident alone determines the direction of these changes, cumulative events such as the SS Eastland disaster contribute to a broader shift in how safety is conceptualized within maritime practice. Public attention toward the disaster steadily diminishes as subsequent historical events reshape collective focus, leaving the SS Eastland increasingly situated within archival rather than active cultural memory. In the immediate aftermath, the scale of loss and the unusual nature of the capsizing within a confined river environment ensured sustained public scrutiny. But as years pass, the event becomes gradually absorbed into a broader timeline of industrial and urban history, where many significant incidents compete for attention. The way such events persist in public awareness is often shaped not only by their magnitude, but by how frequently they are revisited through education, media, and institutional reference, meaning that even tragedies of considerable scale can become less visible when they are no longer part of recurring public discourse. In this case, the SS Eastland remains present in historical records and maritime studies, yet its position in collective memory becomes increasingly specialized, discussed more within focused historical contexts than within general cultural awareness. Over time, this transition reflects a wider pattern in how societies retain fragments of past events while allowing their immediacy to fade, replacing lived recollection with structured documentation and interpretive summaries. Daily commercial navigation resumes along the Chicago River at the location of the incident, where ongoing industrial activity proceeds, across the same waterway that once contained the overturned vessel. The river continues to function as a working component of Chicago's industrial landscape, supporting transportation, manufacturing access, and urban infrastructure in a continuous flow that extends far beyond any single historical moment. Bridges operate on their schedules, vessels pass through established channels, and the surrounding city maintains its industrial rhythm without interruption from the events that once occurred along its edge. Over time, the physical environment remains consistent in its function, even as historical significance becomes layered beneath ongoing activity, creating a space where present-day operations exist alongside an often unseen historical depth. In this way, the Chicago River serves as both a practical infrastructure system and a silent holder of layered history, where past and present occupy the same physical corridor without directly intersecting in daily awareness. Beyond the reach of continued observation, the event persists only through fragmented records and the unchanged presence of the river that once contained it.